Okay, everybody, if we think we've got enough participants to start with, perhaps we can go ahead and kick it off. Does that sound good?
Yep, sounds
All
good.
right. So hi, everybody. My name is Emily Humphrey. I'm from Michael von Valkenburgh Associates, and here with Emily Mueller-DeSellis and Jason Siebenmorgan, who are going to be presenting tonight, as well as Cynthia Wilkie from Friends of Corktown Common. And we have put together a webinar tonight about the design, vision, and maintenance for Corktown Common. And this really originated from, some conversations with Waterfront Toronto and Friends of Corktown Common to have a discussion about what the original vision was for Corktown Common, and to have a discussion that was focused on planting and the planting design in Corktown Common and how it's evolved over time, and how it's maintained as a part of the waterfront wilderness in Toronto. So with that, we'll take a look at the agenda, which Emily Mueller-DeSellis will go through, and then we'll hand it off to Cynthia for a introduction.
Hi, everyone. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about tonight, Cynthia Wilkie will be giving an introduction, as Emily said, to the Friends of Corktown, and then what we'll do is we'll dive in and talk about the project origins, and I'll give that description, as well as the overall design vision that we had for the park itself. And then Jason Siebenmorgan is going to talk about the planting design for Corktown and the planting establishment and that whole process that we had in terms of taking this industrialized site and turning it into a naturalized condition. And then after that, we're going to be talking just about the approach to maintenance, and that is based in an organic approach. And then after that, we will also have questions and answer period. So with that, we will turn it over to Cynthia to go through her description of Friends of Corktown and what kind of brought us all here.
Thanks, Emily. And on behalf of Friends of Corktown Common, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you and the other Emily and Jason here tonight. And as always, to express our thanks to Waterfront Toronto for organizing this event, which they did at the request of Corktown Common, Friends of Corktown Common, which is a group that started in 2013, got interrupted by the Pan Am Games, and has restarted in the last year or so. And this is an event that we wanted to bring to neighbors and the wider community, because we've had two walking tours actually in Corktown Common, and it is clear people have a real appetite for learning more about the park. New residents are thrilled to live on the edge of such a beautiful feature, and are very interested in knowing the details. And I invite any interested viewers who would like to join us. Friends of Corktown Common is one of a number of friends groups in Toronto that help to animate parks and also to maintain and provide some stewardship for parks. So we have a number of programs. We have a Facebook page called Friends of Corktown Common. Please join us. So very quickly, in 1997, the West Don Lands Committee, which I'm also co-chair of, was formed when the government of the day nearly sold the West Don Lands, including the Corktown Common lands, to a harness racing consortium. Fortunately, that deal fell apart, and the rest is history of a very celebratory sort. Part of that history was the local community's spirited campaign for a significant park within the West Don Lands. To us, the idea of a park was both practical and symbolic. Practical in the sense that there was a severe lack of green recreational infrastructure in what was a post-industrial gritty neighborhood. and symbolic as it would signal the renewal of a neighborhood that was being brought back to life through Waterfront Toronto's revitalization of the waterfront. At the top of the community's wish list was the creation of a direct connection to the Don River and restoration of the natural river-related ecosystem that the 19th and 20th century industry had displaced. While the community dreamed of and fought for a sustainable and equitable community anchored by a new park, we could never have imagined the beautiful place that Michael van Valkenburgh and his colleagues have actually created for us. We know that Corktown Common is an asset that can nurture and delight residents and visitors for 7 generations and more. And we're forever grateful to Waterfront Toronto for bringing these brilliant designers to Toronto, both for Corktown Common and for what is becoming the new mouth of the Don River. So I think you'll really enjoy hearing from Emily, and Jason about the design process and features of this special place. And I turn it back to you, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I mean, it's so touching actually to hear you talk about this, because we were hired in 2005 to start the design of Corktown Common, and Cynthia sat on the steering committee, and so I've known you for so long at this point now, and it's just so great to hear you talk about the original vision of Corktown, because we really took that to heart, and it was the basis and foundation of the way that we approached the design. This is an image of the first day, the celebratory kickoff of Corktown Common, the wonderful day that we had, where it was so fantastic that the opening of the park, the Friends of Corktown Common were already established, and they actually, you all established even before the park opened, and it's a testament to the kind of activism that you all have started with from the very beginning, as the park was in formation and in construction. So next slide. Oh, oops. There we go. So I'm going to talk first about the kind of the underpinnings of the design and what led us to there, just to build on what Cynthia was saying. Corktown Common is a quite unique park in that it is a park that you know, has all of the typical features of an urban park that provides space for communities to enjoy being immersed in nature within the city. But it also is a very unique park in that it sits on top of a flood protection landform, which is a piece of green infrastructure that basically made it so that this whole area of the new West Donlands that was created out of this project could actually happen. It was because of the flood protection landform, and the challenge that we were given once we were hired to design Corktown Common with Waterfront Toronto. The challenge that we were given was to take this piece of green infrastructure and actually turn it into a really vibrant urban park that would be able to answer the kind of needs of the community at large, and also become a destination park as well. So we were really excited about the prospect of being able to do this, and to actually merge the idea of having an urban park that sits on top of a landform that is able to make it so that these lands that were subject to flooding could actually be developed. Next slide. What we also were really excited about once we were brought on board to do the design of this park was to kind of take a step back and look at the role that Corktown Common would be playing, not only within the West Donlands, but the larger parklands of Toronto, and the fact that it was at a really critical moment and location within the city, where it's basically is at the kind of intersection between where the Don River Valley enters into the Lake Ontario. And this project in concert with the Portland's project that we're working on just to the south, the two of those projects are going to be providing flood protection for the development of this whole area. But at the same time, it also gives us the opportunity to really make these larger connections to the larger natural systems of the Don River Valley as it enters into Lake Ontario. And next slide, thank you. The big challenge here, though, is that the reason why we were brought on is that over time, as the river was industrialized, it was channelized, and it really started to create this kind of condition where it fought the natural systems here and made it so that a river that really needs to be wide and have a large floodplain is channelized. And as you can see with this overlay, what happened is that over time it broke the bounds of that channelization. And this is an image of Hurricane Hazel, and this actually is of the Humber River. But the same thing happened within the Don River in 1954. And what that did was set up a condition where the TRCA and, the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority started to look at different ways of thinking about flood protection that wasn't about necessarily channelizing and using that kind of infrastructure, but using bioengineering to think about how to deal with this. That, as well as Cindy was talking about, in 1989, that the group Bringing Back the Dawn was formed and started to think about different ways of re-engaging the natural systems of the Don River and understanding how to start to take that channelized condition and break it down and re-engage the natural systems that were inherent within the Don River. So next slide. The issues that were really starting to compound for the site was that this is a site that was constantly being flooded, and for it to be able to be developed, that was necessary to introduce this flood protection landform, which is more of a kind of a dike rather than having it be a hard wall. What that does is it starts to allow for the development and protection of 210 hectares of land that basically created the West Don lands again. Next slide. And so in 2005, we entered a kind of competition to be able to do the design of this park. And the challenge of basically taking these fallow lands and kind of abandoned industrialized lands that had been subject to flooding and create this new park so that the West Don lands could be developed, and to create a new community that's in such an important part of Toronto, so close to downtown Toronto, and important ecological part of the Don River. Next slide. So this is what the site looked like when we were initially brought onto the project, with the Don River channelized here, with tons of infrastructure just all around surrounding the context of the Don River, and thinking about what it meant to bring back the Don in this particular context. The other aspect that was really fascinating to us as we were starting to understand the context and mapping the area was that in 1990s, you can see the diagram on the left here that talks about the fact that the watershed for the Don was basically about 70% impervious. And then by 2005, when we were hired to start to look at the design of Corktown Common, it had jumped to 84% impervious. And now that we're at 2022, you can imagine that the percentages are still kind of exponentially expanding. And so, you know, it's even more of an imperative for this project with Corktown Common, as well as the Portlands, in terms of climate change and being able to really understand how we need to adapt to conditions that are presenting themselves. In terms of the MVA design vision, we really were fascinated by this condition of all of the kind of deep ecology that was already there before any of the kind of colonization and industrialization of the site. The mouth of the Don was a really important ecological natural system here in the Ashbridges Bay. It was one of the largest estuaries in all of North America. And over time, it became industrialized, which happened to many waterways because of just the kind of fluidity of those waterways, made it kind of easy to be able to introduce highways and movement systems along those edges. And so much like any other 19th century cities, this area developed in terms of being an industrialized condition. But you can see how it is in such a sensitive area. What we also did was, as we were starting to look at the design, which we often do, is we go out to the context and understand what the larger kind of analog sites are that should be the basis for what we're working on. And so these are, images of the Don River Ravine, which is really quite important in terms of thinking about how to take a site like the original Corktown Common site was, which was quite flat, and thinking about how to relate it back to the ravine system, which has this amazing forested area of it, but also the topography that starts to create these sheltered conditions, and how we can bring that back to the site as well. So next slide. The other aspect that we were looking at was the really important ecological role that this site plays in the migratory route of the migratory birds that go all the way from Canada down to South America and then back again. And the fact that once they are either taking off and going over Lake Ontario or coming back from going over Lake Ontario, it's important to create shelter and topography and food sources for the birds to be able to continue up the Don River Valley. And so we were really thinking about how the naturalization of this site could become a stop for that to happen and to create a habitat to support the birds. Next slide. So when we were brought onto the site in 2005, this is what it looked like. It was an absolutely flat site that basically had these amazing attributes to it, though. Incredible views out to downtown Toronto. You can see what has happened in the past, like over, I guess, 17 years now. The skyline of Toronto has changed so much, but incredible views down Front Street towards downtown Toronto. And then if you take a 180 and turn right around and look over towards the Don River, you can see that in fact you actually can't see the Don River because of the rail lines that go along the edge. And so it was a real challenge for us to think about how to bring this sense of the Don out of the channel and over to the edge of the park, so that this part of the city could really feel the sense that this is a naturalized area, that it's part of the Don River ravine system as it transitions into the mouth of the Don. So this is a series of sections going basically through the park that show diagrammatically our thought process, that the challenge was having this flat site and the fact that the regulatory floods actually go up to elevation 80, but the existing condition was at 76. And so thinking about how, working with the engineers, that land had to be lifted to 80 to be able to flood protect the land, and so development could happen. But then working with the engineers, thinking about how to transform this into a park that allows for people to be really embedded in nature. So thinking about how to even exaggerate the topography even more so to create that kind of sheltered condition for the habitat, but then also for park making, so that as you are in a park and more sheltered, that you could have more of a variety of landscape experience, and that would basically not only satisfy having a habitat for all of the wildlife that this was supporting, but then also the human occupation and use of the park, being able to carve out these programmatic places within the park and understand how it can support the larger community as well. So working with Cindy and others of the executive committee that were incredibly helpful to understand what the desires were for a community which, as you all know, the Donlands, then the new community that is adjacent to the park wasn't there yet. So we were working with the larger community of Corktown and the distillery and all the adjacent communities to understand what this park needed to provide so that it would be a park for everybody. And what we did was basically think about all the different ways that you could be embedded within a park and be embedded in nature and also within the city. So it ranges in programmatic activities, from water play to sledding in the winter to nature trails, places to gather, a couple of lawns, both recreation and more open-ended event lawns, play spaces, and then also the marsh, being able to really be embedded within a place that has water that connects to the Don River, and also, you know, thinking about how this is a full season park, that you would have winter activities as well as summer activities. So the other aspect that we were looking at too is satisfying the idea of flood protection and all of the different programs within the park, but then also thinking about how this can be a really sustainable park that is embedded within water management, and how to be able to take all of the water that comes onto the park and work with it to filter it and have it basically come from the water play. Water gets filtered and sent through to the marsh, then that gets sent through the marsh to the irrigation tank and then goes out to the rest of the park. But the idea that basically this park sustains itself and that it doesn't put any kind of water burden on the rest of the surrounding sewers in this area. So thinking about how, even though it's doing flood protection, it's also being very cognizant of managing its own water. Another aspect that was a real driver within the design was the fact that this was an industrialized site that was also environmentally being a post-industrial site, was a brownfield. We had to bring in every drop of soil so that to make sure that the soil was horticulturally sound and could support all the trees and plant communities that we were bringing into the park. And so there was a lot of research that we did and design of the soils to be able to support the different types of plant communities and ecologies that this naturalized park was introducing. Next slide. So, you know, ultimately, with all of these drivers being flood protection, program and activities for the community, making sure that it was sustainable and making sure that it was going to be able to thrive as a naturalized condition, we really, you know, had at the very basis of this the fact that this was going to be in a naturalized park, as Cindy described, that, you know, that this really needed to be a green space and that it needed to be this kind of immersive natural experience, connecting people back to the landscape of the Don River. So, you know, we really based our design on just bringing the Don back to the West Don lands. So I'm going to hand it over to Jason, who's going to walk us through the planting design.
Great, thank you, Emily. So I want to start addressing the planting design, but also just picking up on what Emily's been saying. You know, there was a real design vision for this sustainable water system. The park had to function as flood protection, which meant that it had a wet side and a dry side of that landform, and planting had to accommodate those conditions. And then also this quite diverse array of program was desired for the park as well. So trying to figure out a planting system to embed all of those different types of program, also adapt to the site. It's actually a very windy site, and make it as diverse and complex as possible. We built a lot of landforms, which gave us a lot more play with creating a sunny side and a shady side of a slope, a higher, drier area or a lower, wetter area. So it gave us an opportunity to start developing these different planting typologies and locating them in these very specific microclimates of the park as it was developing. And the first thing I want to talk about is the kind of structure of the park that comes through the trees and the canopy. I don't know, Emily, I might have you jump in at some point and talk a little bit about some of the initial constraints that came with the and directives of the planting being native and also budget wise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that was another challenge. It was another driver in that working with the Infrastructure Ontario and the GRCA, there was a real desire to see this as a pilot project as well in terms of native planting. So we were given the directive to use as much native planting as possible, which we were able to achieve. We did, in terms of the planting plan, have about 95% of the planting palette was native. The 5% that was non-native was more at the edge of the park along the street as it transitioned into the city. But this was a really unusual condition and became kind of a showcase of what it meant to establish a native forest and a native landscape.
Exactly, great. And also I think there was this element of a very tight budget. So it was something that came out very early on, as the size of the trees were smaller than we would typically use in an urban park, mainly because you want to present this to the community. And on day one, you really want to give them a good, robust park that's really clearly defined structurally. So this was a real challenge to start out with smaller caliber trees. They really ranged from 40 millimeters up to 75 was the kind of the main bulk of the trees. So young trees, and they don't have a lot of oomph yet, and especially in a kind of at this time, a very expansive site, right? Because you have to remember there were no buildings around. That all came after the park. So this was kind of a moonscape. So we developed this idea of what we called the fast growing frame. So we selected a number of native trees that are known for their rapid growth and layered that into a more traditional mixed forest palette. So, poplars, silver maples, birches in the fast growing frame, whereas then we would have oaks and maples in what was meant to be the kind of long-term mixed forest of the site that would provide that structure. And you can see in this diagram the kind of orange dots that follows the landform itself. So we're taking advantage of the extra height of our tallest landform and putting small trees on it that grow fast to give us that real structure that holds the space of the park. Okay, next slide. So this is the kind of mixed forest. This is fairly recently, within the last 3 years, I would say. So you can see there's a lot of layering going on here. It's not just the canopy trees, but lots of understory, a lot of witch hazels. There's even a plant that I'm very fond of called bladdernut, Staphylea. It's a kind of small suckering native shrub. And then all the way down to a very rich woody, shrubby, and also herbaceous layer on the ground plane. And then the fast growing frame. So you can see in this image, there's a few poplars poking up with the green leaves. And then the kind of mid band is that mixed forest of oaks and celtis. So common hackberry is a prominent tree, and then a whole mix of oak species. And one interesting thing is Emily was talking about, this was a completely industrial site. So we had to bring in all the soil. It was completely manufactured soil to build up the park and create the planting soils. And one of the first things we ran into there was the issue of pH of the soils. So because of needing a very sandy mix to be a free draining mix on the slopes, the pH was extremely high, so close to 8, which is very, very basic. If 7 is neutral, and we really aim for 6.5 as an ideal growing medium, that really limited our planting palette, because we actually had quite a few species that would have been happier on the more acidic side originally. So we had a process of editing out. So this planting palette really had lots of constraints. So, every time you turn around, there would be another thing that would reduce the plant list a little bit more. And we still wanted to create as much diversity as possible. And then again, this very rich layering effect. I'm just including a couple very nerdy plant images. I hope we've got some folks here to appreciate it. But Rus aromatica, the common fragrant sumac, it's not the grow low variety that you see in all the parking lots, but this is the real proper straight species. And that was, being asked to use native species was great in a lot of ways. It was definitely a challenge, but it also gave us a lot of ability to push harder on sourcing plants. So a lot of plants that are not common in the trade, we actually could put a little more effort in finding the straight species, not the cultivar that made its way into the trade. And also you have to remember, this was 10 years ago, and the planting industry has changed tremendously. There's so many more amazing native plants that are readily available, which we're finding for Portland and some of our other projects, which is really fantastic. But this was really early in the stages, so there was a lot of hunting going on. And then you can see this kind of in the aerial view to the right-hand side is that fast-growing frame merging into the mixed forest that really holds the playground and the pavilion and even the gathering lawn in the middle. And then there were a few areas, I think if you can remember back to that first diagram, where there were a few shady slopes. So this is the northeast side of the lawn bowl. So another one of our higher slopes, but it gave us an opportunity to introduce ferns even from the very beginning, which is always a challenge because you don't have the canopy to provide the shade that you really need. But we chose tough species that kind of, they looked a little sad the first couple of years, but this is even just 2 or 3 years into the planting. They've really taken hold. And this was another little bit of a stretch, but these are tulip poplars, a whole grove of tulip poplars that surround the stairs as a nod to the Carolinian forest. But you know, at the time, it's like, are we pushing it a little too much? Is it too far north for these trees to really survive and happy? But with climate change, it's really been in our favor, and these trees have done exceptionally well. So once we've developed this kind of structure of the canopy and more spatial structure of the park, then we were able to turn to the ground plane. And again, with all these different microclimates, there's a real desire to get as much diversity of a native palette as possible. And so you can see a whole range of different plant typologies and, you know, their location in a very specific microclimate. And the marsh is part of this water system that Emily described as a recirculating system, stormwater system, and then it feeds back into the irrigation system so it can hold water for a period, and then it can be used in dry periods when the other plants in the park really need it. But it is kind of, I think it's like the heart of the park in a way to me. I think the marsh is really key to the place of Corktown Common. So this is an early photo getting the emergent species established and off to a good start. And then as you move up from the water towards the edge, we have mountain mint and of course the beautiful cardinal flower, which is always a delight when it blooms. And you can see pollinators went right for this mix. And then as you move into that woodland shrub area that I was describing earlier, the mixed forest, again, this is where we really have this dense layering, and it's on the backside of the park. So we wanted a little more density to help shelter and protect the play area. And then all the way down to, you know, spreading ground covers and little, you know, nice woodland perennials. Another detail of the black chokeberry, and of course the asters and goldenrod having a good time. And then all of that comes together to form this overall structure, and it's the kind of texture and feel of the park. So we have this grand vision, we have this great plant palette that we've developed and worked through in all these different ways. And then how do you build this? How do you actually get plants growing and established once the material's been sourced? And this is something that we deal with daily on our projects and really have put a lot of effort in trying to be strategic about how a park develops and how we can be involved in that. And it's really setting a process in motion. I mean, if you look at any of our projects, we have a very wild aesthetic. So we took to this, you know, whole premise of Corktown Common very quickly, but it's really about setting this process in motion. Right at the beginning, we have all of these wonderful plants that arrive on site. That's still a construction zone, so there's a lot of protecting of plants as they're going in slowly. And even with the marsh planting, this was kind of amazing. This was the first part of the park to be planted, and the truck arrived and unloaded all of these wetland plants, lots of rushes and sedges. And before the plants were even off the truck, the dragonflies were there mating and laying eggs on the flats. And it's just like, okay, everybody, just slow down. We're going to get this planted tomorrow, and you can do what you need to do, which was kind of amazing. It happens all the time. You bring a tree in and you'll have a bird, a mockingbird is ready to nest in the top of the tree before it's even planted. It's just like, thank you, let's go to town. This other image I think is really nice because it shows that cross section, the classic cross section of a wetland edge. So deep water emergence, shallow emergence, right up into the drier bank. And you can see there's a little drip irrigation hose. That was really just for the establishment of those first edges because it's complete construction zone chaos to the left of the screen here. And you can see actually the water should be up to the top level of that drain inlet. And we had to raise the water very slowly as the plants got established so we didn't drown them all in the first day. And then again, we didn't have as many plants as we would normally like to have to cover a park of this size. So we had to be very strategic about how we use the ground cover plants. We wanted to invest enough in the trees because that's the really important structure. But then also, you know, as any gardener knows, bare ground is an issue. That's where you just invite trouble. So we were strategic about laying out our plants in these kind of patches or dots so they would grow together and protect themselves, but then could eventually increase in size and start to close up the bare ground in between. So again, a few more of those original perennials just going in. And then this was actually a long process of getting this park established. We were quite excited because the park was built. Again, there was no buildings around. It was planned for the Pan Am Games. So the park was going to sit for 2 years before it was open to the public. And we thought, oh, fantastic. The plants will finally have a chance to get established before all the marauders of the public come in and start having fun in the park as they build the buildings around for Pan Am, and that takes place. And unfortunately, it kind of went the other way. There just wasn't as much care, and you have to give a lot of credit to the public for seeing things. And I think for Cynthia and her group would have been in the park and pointing out things and making phone calls and sending messages to everybody that something's going on. And that didn't happen because it was really closed and it was just the contractor maintaining it and maintaining it with a very light hand. So there was a whole list of issues that started to develop over that time. And before I get into the really ugly bit, I just want to run through these few images of the Marsh Bowl where we actually planted quite densely with switchgrass underneath the poplar grove. And Emily, you can just flip through these images. It's really was a total success right off the bat. So it's a good, robust plant. This is one of my favorite things to put in an urban park because it's just super tough and it's beautiful. We have rare field sparrows nesting in big patches of similar grass in Brooklyn Bridge Park now. But it really took off and we had no weed issues in this area. And then in the summer, it's this lush, green, beautiful, dense grass. Again, the ferns getting established on the outside of that bowl. And then this is kind of the reality of that time. You can see there's a lot of bare ground after 2 years. The patches are getting established, things are growing in well, but without the real attention to care. The next slide, please. We had this happen, which was really unfortunate, and it's still unclear whether this came in the soils or if it was in some of the root balls from the nurseries that it just wasn't seen. But this is horsetail. It's an equisetum that is just a nightmare. It's really one of the most aggressive as you can see. It's actually kind of beautiful if you can squint your eyes hard enough. But it just takes over everything. It gets in all the root balls. It gets into absolutely everything. And the problem with it is it's extremely difficult to get rid of because every time you pull on it and any piece that you break of root, it just generates more plants. So as you start to attack it, it just expands. It's like trebles. They just get bigger and bigger and more. So this was a real issue that we started with. And actually, the best technique for this is called cardboard lasagna, where basically, I guess Emily, this was at 2 years, right? And so this is when PF&R came in, and we actually had a trained horticulturist that was handed a big hairy beast, basically, right?
Yeah, and because this was a pilot project, PF&R invested in having an organic maintenance management consultant come in, and she was able to help kind of identify this issue that we all saw, but identify a really effective and tried and true long time technique of this kind of lasagna mulching, where you basically suppress the sunlight and water and for the weeds. And so what that does is it allows all of the other intended plants to start to take over. But it's a very long and involved process in terms of how to do that. So that was something that we were very impressed with in terms of being able to really take the time and basically turn the landscape back over to being a kind of healthy ecosystem of all of the different intended plant communities. But it took a few years to be able to get back to that level.
I'll just interrupt. There was a question, what is PF&R, which is Parks, Forestry and Recreation, City of Toronto, which has taken on maintenance of the park very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So, sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. Sorry, there's so many acronyms. I apologize.
Exactly. And so, and if I'm correct, they're in charge of all of the urban park spaces in the city of Toronto, right? So they have a lot to take care of. So fortunately, this technique of laying down cardboard, so the best thing to do with this equisetum, the horsetail, is smother it. And it takes time. So it's not a quick thing, but you just have to have patience and keep after it. So cardboard down, lots of mulch on top of it, suffocate it, smother it, go after it every time it creeps around a corner and gets through a crack in the cardboard. And so after that process, we were left with this area where you can see some of the original planting. The asters were doing fine. They were big and bushy, but we had these bare spots throughout. And so we were able to work with the Parks, Forestry and Recreation to acquire a list of native species that were in plugs, so very inexpensive plant material, but they could cover large areas. And the idea was to create these kind of amoeboid or camouflage pattern shapes of specific species, and species that were chosen that would really spread either through rhizome and making a large patch, or also plants that would actually reseed and colonize different parts of the park. So you can really see here in 2013, this is like after the weed annihilation, there's still some hand weeding going on with the little piles along the path. And then adding in plugs, the asters kind of had a heyday at this period because they seed very freely, and they were kind of a godsend because they really filled in and covered the ground. It was a little bit much. It was beautiful in the fall, but if you took the photo in the middle of the summer, it was green, but it just didn't have that kind of diversity that we were really after. And again, Astermania, and then goldenrod came in on its own. We didn't have to plant that one. And then on the flip side of that is the marsh, which actually established quite quickly. We were strategic about keeping more plant material for this area because we knew the challenges of establishing wetlands. And so we had a greater density of plugs for this area. But even so, right off the bat, the first issue we had was geese and ducks who came in and started pulling out all the plants. I thought, oh, great, you built a wetland for us, thank you. So the first thing was to fence and put up string lines to keep them out from destroying the plants right off the start. We have the nice European non-native yellow flag iris popped up that either came in a nursery pot or some of these plants just seem to materialize out of thin air. So that had to be removed. Next slide. Starting to grow in, looking really nice and lush. Lots of algae starts to form in the water because we still have patches of open water. The marsh was really designed to be fully planted with only a couple areas of quite deep water, which helped hold the volume of storm water we needed, but also that deep water allowed for water lilies to be grown there and some of the submergent plants. And then any other area we were trying to get full coverage on, so we didn't have the algal blooms. And then again, the fantastic fall astro shot, things are really filling in. You see the water is no longer visible. The iris and sedges and rushes have filled in. Again, another fall shot as it's evolving. And then again, it's still quite beautiful in winter, you know, which is really nice. And I think part of this is it's a management strategy, and it's also educating the public. Like, this is okay for a public park to look like this. It doesn't have to be mown and shorn and trimmed up and put to bed every winter. It can be a little hairy and rough, and there's seed heads and dry grasses. And I think it's really in the field, it's really shifting. So it's great to see urban parks that have this kind of character. And this was definitely an early one in that process. So now we've built the park, we've been through a couple hurdles of getting things established, and then it's really like, how do you move forward and help develop a system to maintain a public landscape through purely organic means? And we learned a lot through this process, and it's kind of shifted in our minds now from just very rigid maintenance to what we're referring to as adaptive management. So again, it's this having more flexibility. It's like you're setting something in motion that's going to continually evolve, and you just kind of try and keep it in check and direct it a little bit, but you're never in full control. So again, part of that process was choosing these quite aggressive perennials to just fill in the space and start a kind of baseline that you can work from adding in more plants. And Emily, do you want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, I can talk to this. So starting or introducing a brand new park that's naturalized. This was a very new concept for the city of Toronto and the parklands. It was the first large-scale naturalized park that had been built in decades, and so I think as everybody was planning for it and really excited about it, the Parks and Forestry and Recreation Department really understood that this was going to be something brand new, a new type of parkland that they needed to understand how to help establish and then maintain it over the years. And so the thing that was really wonderful about this kind of partnership between Waterfront Toronto and the City of Toronto is that they also saw that this was a pilot program in a sense of thinking about how to introduce organic landscape management to establish this brand new park that, you know, as Jason said, you know, the dragonflies saw this as a, you know, a brand new habitat, but and that was, you know, an amazing thing that we always see in our parks as we redevelop these lands that are fallow and that they become brand new naturalized ecosystems. But at the same time, so much work goes on behind the scenes to make that happen, especially in the early years. And so what we did was we were looking at how to think about managing the soil. So what we did was we put together an organic landscape management manual for the Parks Department to use as a pilot program, and basically start to think about management of the landscape and establishment of it through its soil, because the soil is really this kind of structural underlayment that needed to be basically a spark plug needed to happen to turn it back into this condition that, you know, over millennia, natural landscapes evolve and start to stabilize in a sense. So we had to try and figure out how to do that in a much shorter time period of a couple years. So as we were putting the park together in terms of installing it, we were also working closely with the Parks and Forestry and Recreation to put together this manual that basically laid out through the seasons, weekly, daily, what needed to happen to be able to basically establish this park and turn it into a self-sustaining, in a sense, landscape that would also, you know, no landscape is ever no maintenance, but how to work with the landscape itself once it's established, to understand how to react to certain conditions, so that you're not just going in with the kind of typical mow, blow, and go maintenance regimes, but thinking about how to look at what the different landscapes or different planting communities are showing you, so that you can react to it. So, you know, it's a really complex proposal to do this, and we learned quite a lot, as well as the Parks Department learning quite a lot in terms of how to take this body of work and turn it into something that is kind of like a living document, and taking the basis of it and seeing how the landscape started to fill in and take on a life of its own. The kind of manual did as well. And we were really excited to see that the gardeners who are within the PFNR, how they embraced the manual, but then also started to work with what they saw happening out in the field as well. So Jason, I'll have you take over from here, because I know that you are working closely with Kat on this too.
Yeah, so again, it's really about a more lengthy process and coaxing something along. So we had a fantastic gardener. I know that's not the desired term, horticulturist, but I love gardeners because they know what they're doing. And we were very fortunate to have Kat come in at this kind of key moment, and she really embraced the whole kind of idea of the park and started adding in species very slowly, and really, as Emily said, it's really about looking and reading the landscape and listening to it and trying to understand what's going on and where there's a problem or where something might be shifting to another, you know, slightly more different typology. It's getting shadier. An area is actually wet now. So, you know, maybe the drainage isn't working quite as well. There's some compaction, then that leaves an opportunity for a different kind of plant species. And if you pay attention to that, it's not necessarily a problem, as it can be an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So she was adding in lots of fantastic species, and we get to that other image of like this whole mix of things. I mean, there's a thalictrum there, a meadow rue, which is not a plant we could have started with, but it's so great to see it in the park now. And even things that are persisting, like the Canada anemone, which is a real bully in most landscapes, and it covered the ground for us for a long time. I mean, Michael has, probably from this project even, seeing it here, has it in his own garden on Martha's Vineyard, and he sends me these photos and he's like, it's lifting up my brick path. It's like, I didn't plant it, you know, you did that. But it's true. It's great in its place, but you also have to be careful about it. And that's often the case with many of the native species. And they have a certain look in the wild, and then you bring them in a cultivated situation and they behave completely differently. So you do have to be on your toes about that a little. But you know, this is one of our favorite photographs of the park. So this is the Yellowwood Grove that's just, you know, kind of this island that reaches out into the marsh, and this incredible diversity of species that's getting established there along the edges. Of course, the marsh is ultimately one of the most rich habitats, but it's just so fantastic to see it coming together and evolving, becoming something else than we had actually thought was going to happen. So we just wanted to touch on briefly this other little project that's a little further down the river. You can see here, just as a scale comparison to get your mind around it, there's the plan for Corktown Common on the left, overlaid on the Portlands. And that is part of Promontory Park that it's covering, and then there's the whole river valley and what we call the forest frame around it. So much bigger. We learned a lot and are still learning from Corktown Common, which is great. That's the beauty of landscapes. And it's really nice as designers to have relationships with the parks after they've been built, because you learn so much and you can help, just coax it along. And this is one of the things that we started looking at for Portland's. Again, not a lot of budget because of the scale of it. The trees, we're investing in even smaller trees for this project than we even had in Corktown Common. So starting off with small trees and this issue of bare ground. So in this instance, we're actually looking at doing seeding grasses because it's going to be very sunny and hot to start. The trees will grow in and start to shade out, as you can see here in these illustrations, that the grasses start to shade out and change and leave an opportunity for another plant type to come in. And this is a conversation, this has been a great tool for us to help understand the design and the process of the park, but also as a tool to communicate with the client group. And, again, PF&R is going to inherit this project. And it's been great to have them involved in the design process where we can talk through these things, and they totally understand it, and they see the opportunities, the importance especially of getting the ground covered, and then the opportunities down the road to introduce a different species. This is where the spring ephemerals start to come in 20 years. And then that also was folded into the next maintenance manual, which really is about this idea of adaptive management. So it's got a lot more flex into it, and it's really, going out and looking and seeing an issue, and then you can come back and use this as a tool to get some ideas about how to approach. If you have a slope that's starting to degrade, or you have a shaded out area now where the grasses have gotten thin, there's an opportunity. What's the plant palette that we can use there? And again, it's not like you're going to come in and roll out a whole new carpet of planting, but looking at some of these ecological studies, this is actually at a school in Sweden where there are these little pockets of shade-loving plants are introduced, and then it's like seeding a larger planting. They start to spread and can colonize a larger area. And this image on the lower left is Brooklyn Bridge Park. This was a totally sunny switchgrass slope 15 years ago. Now it is all bluebells and mayapples, which is kind of fantastic. And then also pruning is another big part of it, and how to coax the planting along. Again, you're starting with small trees. They're going to be more in your face in the scale of the human body, but how do you start to train them to lift them up? And views are very important in the design of Portland. So you can see out from the forest frame and the main park edge into this beautiful river valley. We don't want to just wall it off, but we also don't want somebody to say, oh, well, there should be a view here. So you clear cut a whole swath of trees so you can see out. And this is to look at a more subtle approach of just actually creating little windows, or instilling the fact that you can actually see through trees. You don't have to take them all out, but you can trim branches and allow the trunks to be there and keep the canopy overhead. And there's Corktown Common, so back to the Marsh Bowl. And then again, Emily, do you want to just wrap it up?
Yeah, so we just wanted to put this image back up on the screen to think about how Corktown Common was a real, it's been such an interesting project in so many ways in terms of how people have embraced it. I mean, I was, like I said, with the very first day of the opening that Friends of Corktown were there and were already formed, and the amount of people who it was incredible to see just would jump over the hoarding of all of the construction that was around the site still going up in the West Donlands, and they just came, just like the dragonflies came to what you were saying, Jason, to the plants. The people were coming to the park, and it was just so fantastic. And we've learned so much about how important this particular project is to Toronto that it's informed the rest of the work that we're doing currently at the Portlands. And so, you know, we're really excited about how these two parks are going to start to really complete that system and bring the Don down to Lake Ontario and hopefully bring it back and realize what Cindy and the people with Bring Back the Dawn were really thinking about back in the 80s. So I think with that, we are done with our thoughts on the design, and we can go to the question and answer. I think that Kate was going to collect all of the questions that have been asked, and we're going to she's going to moderate it, and we'll try and answer any of those questions that we've seen popped up as we've been talking.
So far, it seems like the questions that have appeared in the chat have been answered by people in the chat. But if you did have a question that wasn't answered and you'd like to ask the team, please raise your hand and or put it in the chat, and we'd happy to have the team answer. Cindy, you have your hand up.
Right, I'll start. And I will just say to people, you've mentioned Brooklyn Bridge Park, which is also the work of your group. And if people go to New York and have a chance to walk through that park, you'll feel how it also uses a similar vocabulary and style. It is like a sister park to Corktown Common, or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know which came first, but another beautiful environment that creates, I mean, I think one of the things that I loved about the planning was after the first public meeting, and there was a public process in addition to the technical advisory committee. After the first public meeting, Michael van Valkenburgh came back to the public and said, well, if we accommodated everything, all of the aspirations for this park, we would need a 900-acre park instead of the 19-acre park we really have. But then said, you know, we can figure out ways of giving you a lot of different experiences. Like you could have a 19-acre park that was just open space, playing fields, and you'd walk in and it would be there. But what has been created here is a series of, I know this is the language of architects, landscape architects, a series of rooms with different experiences, different elevations, different, plantings. And it's created an incredible resource on a very small footprint, because in the end, most of the design is half the park. It's just the wet part of the park as opposed to the meadow side. But I do have a question. My question is, I think that Friends of Corktown Common includes people who are very interested in how the planting gets respected and maintained, and also how you communicate to the public the importance of being careful, like keeping your dogs out of the wetland areas, and taking some care and really understanding the complexity of the planting program. And I'm wondering if your experience working in other places, if you have any advice or are aware of any really ingenious ways that park stewards have managed to communicate that kind of idea and build community support for stewardship and protection of sensitive plantings.
Jason, I'll dive in with kind of what we're doing in Portland's actually. That this is also a kind of a learning process that we've seen, is that we will have a wayfinding and interpretation signage strategy in Portland's to be able to talked to a lot of that. And so that's something that we developed based on a new signage system that the Parks Department has put forth as a larger program rollout that they're doing for the whole parklands. And I think that the way that we've been looking at that, there's this ability to, as the park is used and people start to interact with it, there are going to be these moments that we've planned, but then other moments that one could never know, that unforeseen conditions that and these relationships that you're talking about, Cindy, in terms of how people are using the park. So we do have a strategy to have certain kind of very low-key signage that helps to, in a welcomingly way, helps people to understand to kind of respect the planting and the different landscape elements that are in the park. I know that there's other ways of programming as well, and we've seen that in other parks that we've designed. And I know there's a pretty robust programming for some of the New York parks that we've done, very small park, Artie Park Cities, Teardrop Park. There's a lot of programming that happens that allows people to understand the kind of design intentions, but then also the ecological layer. It becomes a place of discovery for kids and education for kids as they engage the landscape. That at a very small scale. Jason, I'll let you talk to the kind of larger scale of Brooklyn Bridge Park, which actually has a building that houses the environmental programming that happens with the Conservancy there.
Yeah, exactly, which is quite amazing. But I would say that that the kind of like two sides of this. So the horticultural staff, the gardeners that are out and about, like having more of the, I know this is all, I'm talking money, but in the fantasy world, the more gardeners you have in the park, the more presence they have. And people then start to understand, oh, wait, somebody takes care of this. Because I think there's a real disconnect. Like most people will go to a park and they think most people would have no idea what went through the process to generate this park of Corktown Common. And especially when you start designing in naturalistic ways and using ecological systems to generate the park, then it's just wild. It just happened, right? This is nature. So I think when there's a presence of someone taking care of it, whether it's actually, employed horticultural staff, volunteer groups, or also, as the case in Brooklyn Bridge Park, there are really elaborate educational programs. So they bring kids out. There's all kinds of people that come and do, just basic cleanup. They also do a lot of science and biology projects out. They do bug counts. They send them out with nets to do a sweep of the whole grassland planting and then see what they have. And they actually collect all of that data and use it in the park maintenance. But I think it's twofold. So you see people that are actually taking care of it, so that triggers something in your brain. But also, as the volunteer community comes in, they have a bit of ownership of that park. They have a different understanding of it that then gets communicated to other people. And when they're just walking through on another day and the dog is peeing on a shrub, they can say, hey, it's not policing them, but you can also just have a conversation about it and say, actually, this is what's happening, so maybe think about it.
Right. Great. That's really helpful.
Thanks, Emily and Jason. We had a couple of questions in the chat come up. Question one from Franca. Will there be a link between the Portlands and Corktown Common? Will we be able to walk from one to the other without dodging cars?
It's a great question.
Kayak. Kayak.
Yes. So the Don River, the Lower Don Trail that goes along the Don River, you can get into Corktown underneath the the railroad there. That trail is going to continue down and through and go into the Portlands. So ultimately, once the full vision of the Portlands is realized, you will be able to go from Corktown down to the Portlands project via that trail, and which goes along the Don, which is, I think, the best way to experience getting from one park to the next.
Yeah.
So that's going to be with the full vision. It's going to take a little bit of time for that to happen.
Thanks, Emily. A question as well. What happened to the prairie? When I've been there, it's a mowed lawn.
So the prairie was is a very another lesson learned in terms of establishment and being able to get that to happen. The prairie does need to be mown as part of the maintenance of it. So depending on what season you're in, it's mown, and you will see it as what might look like a lawn, although it's not a lawn. It's the grasses have been cut down. The idea was for it to be because it's on the what's called the wet side. There were some regulations in terms of what the planting and program could be in that area, because it is subject to flooding. So we weren't able to have any woody plants in that zone. So it had to be all herbaceous. And referencing the prairies of Ontario and Upper Canada, we introduced the prairie grasses there. Part of the installation process for that, it took a very long time for it to get established, because some of that had to be installed out of season. And so when things are installed in a way that it's not part of the kind of natural rhythms of the planting, it just creates a situation that makes it harder for it to establish. So over the years, it has been turning from a prairie to a meadow, and part of that also is that the PFNR also saw that that was going to be a better plant community for that condition, in terms of being able to have it get established and then also being able to maintain it. So over the years, it has kind of turned with that. But the idea is that it's mown at least once a year to help keep it established as a vegetated cover, rather than it being a woody cover.
I could also add one point, which is that the Friends of Corktown Common is hoping to establish this summer a program of volunteer work on invasive plant removal from the meadow. It's
great.
one of the areas. They're little projects all up and down the Don River, focused on the same thing. And we know that the gardeners at Corktown Common would like to have some help in that project. And so we're, one of our members, Nancy Vanderplatz, has taken a course with Toronto Nature Stewards on leading an invasive plant removal team. And we hope to institute that probably starting in June, and we'll be looking for volunteers. So a little plug for that.
Oh, that's fantastic that you're doing that. It is a challenge that is throughout the whole Don River ravine, that there's, especially when you establish a landscape like that, the kind of, you would hope to be able to control all of the conditions, but even if you can get the installation controlled the way that we know are the best practices, you always have the input of weeds and invasives coming through. And so being able to have volunteer help to manage that, I think that's fantastic that you guys are taking that on.
Yeah, we're excited.
Tell me what weekends, so maybe we can come up and help.
Definitely.
Thanks, Emily and Cindy. That's great. One question, who is Kat from Franca?
You were mentioning Kat.
Sorry, Kat. Sorry. Kat is a so on the staff of Parks, Forestry and Recreation, and she was part of the gardening team. There's and it changes every year, the way that things how it's the Parks Department is structured. But she was there for, I think, 2 years, and which was really great, because when you have somebody who's been who kind of sees a landscape through more than one season, they're able to respond and react. And she just, did a fantastic job embracing the project, and decided to push along that adaptive approach to gardening, of just looking and reading the landscape, like Jason said. And so she just kind of struck out on her own and said, "Hey, I see that there are these bare moments within the ground plane. What can I put there?" And she reached out to Waterfront Toronto to reach out to us to say, "Hey, you guys are the designers. What would you do here?" And so we started a conversation, and it was a really rich conversation to hear like what was working on the ground. And so I don't know, Jason, you should talk more about it, because I know that you had some direct conversations with her in terms of some ideas that she brought to the table.
Yeah, and I mean, part of it too is that she made a very nice list of plants that we have a photograph of. That's like, and the other thing is she came to one of our meetings with the organic maintenance manual, like totally dog-eared and labeled and beat up, and Emily would just like went through the roof. She was like, "Oh my God, this is so fantastic! You're using that thing."
It took a lot to put that thing together.
Yeah, it was a lot of energy went into that. So it was nice to see that it actually was embraced. And it's like, as Emily said, there's a constant change of the gardeners. So Cat is just one example of this whole incredible force of parks, forestry, and recreation. And they all, they're the three elements that come together to manage all of these public spaces.
Thanks, Emily and Jason. There's a question from John. It says, you mentioned pollinators. In what way does the fauna that the park attracts impact the plant life beneficially or as a challenge to manage?
That's a good question. This is where we would need the gardeners to really know some of the challenges. But I think, there's always, this is the oxymoron and the love of the monarch butterfly and the milkweed, is those little worms will eat every one of your seedlings of milkweeds when you put them out. So it really is, you can attract these pollinators in, and there's pollinators that are there to feed on nectar and actually pollinate the plants, which is beneficial to the plants. But they often have these other life cycles that, whether they're a grub or a caterpillar or what, that actually feed on. So you have host plants, which are for the more smaller, younger stages of those insects. And it is a balance. And I think, again, it goes back to this idea of embracing a certain aesthetic. So if something gets eaten, you just say, "Hey, that's great. That was a host plant. That the host came and ate it, and we hope it comes back, or we'll plant more next year and see how it goes." But it's all cyclical, and it changes. Every year is going to be a little bit different. So it's just kind of riding the wave and not being too upset. And I think that's like traditional horticulture and gardening has often been like, if you see a bug, you squash it, but that's not necessarily the best approach. So you're going to have a different aesthetic to the park. That's where the wildness comes in. When something gets eaten, there's something else next to it that can take its place.
Thanks, Jason. And there's a question that just says deer, rabbits, and beavers. So I'm guessing that we're asking if they're coming back or if they will be populating the park.
There is a rabbit
Oh,
or two.
well, that's as long as it's kept in check and doesn't become watership down, I think we'll be okay. They can prune the red twig dogwoods for us, so they have good color each year. I mean, the beaver is an interesting Canadian phenomenon that we are addressing in Portland's, right, Emily? That's a real concern because we're connected to the lake there. So at least further up the Don Corktown, it's not such an issue, but it's a reality, and they can completely cut down your whole mixed forest in no time.
Yeah. So is there a sighting of a beaver in Corktown?
Not that I'm aware of, but
I mean, I know that there's coyote. I've heard that.
the beaver would have quite a challenge getting from the river
there,
into
right?
Corktown Common, through the Bala underpass, over the,
Yeah.
That's true. The flood protection landform.
Yeah.
Apparently beavers are active in the brickworks.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Well, hopefully they stay up there.
Yeah.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. Is there anything anyone else would like to ask before we sign off for the night? If you do have more questions that you think of later, you can always email us at info@waterfronttoronto.ca, and we'll put the email in the chat as well. So I just want to say thank you.
I see Neil
I see a hand.
Betteridge has had his hand up for a bit, so maybe he can.
I didn't.
Yes. Thanks, Cindy. Sorry, I'm sometimes Teams doesn't give access to chat. So first off, thank you all for this incredible park. It's just been such a boon to my mental health, particularly the last few years being in nature, and such a gift for all of us living in the tall towers. Secondly, so delighted, Emily, that we have you on Waterfront Toronto's design review panel, and that the good work that you and Jason are doing into the Portlands will hopefully carry over. The question, I guess, is as I walk along Mill and Bayview in front to get to and from the park, all of that fabulous nature in the park is such a contrast to a little bit the sadness of the planters and the silvacells. And I'm wondering if there are any resources that we can try and use or influence the different buildings and the like to use to put some more appropriate plantings and not just be a source of invasive species.
So, it's interesting. We worked very closely with the rest of the West Donlands because the concept of the West Donlands is so I'd say really forward thinking. I was really struck by the aerial that we put together for this project of what was there in 2005 when we were hired and what's there now, and you could see all of these amazing green roofs and the kind of sustainability of what's going on in the West Donlands. I mean, I think that a lot of this is in the public realm is also inherited by the Parks Department. I think it's more the forestry. So I don't know if there's another kind of process that could happen in terms of the Friends of Corktown Common becoming part of the kind of public realm of the West Donlands. But that's potential process that could happen as well. I mean, when we think of the Corktown Common, the larger ecosystem of that, we've always thought of the whole development and how it relates back to the larger public realm. So having it be more seamless and you know, we would embrace that. I mean, but again, like every landscape kind of settles in on its own, and how it's then maintained and then transforms into its own character, I think is a really important thing. And so, you know, if I think having the community take a part of that is a really important thing. And it seems like you all have a lot of the ability to do that. So I'd say go for it.
I think that the Friends of that's another little project that the Friends of Corktown Common has sort of their eye on, or a small piece of that, Neil, is to work on the tree pits where the trees are planted. They have been largely neglected and they're full of weeds, and you know, people aren't taking care of them. So we would like to start a program of getting them adopted, or maybe some funding so that it could be a, you know, a student summer project, planting and looking after them, things like that. So that's a small piece, but that we, you know, we're trying to figure out how to put together the resources and the idea, the information to activate that idea.
Awesome. Thanks, Cindy.
We saw somebody come on the screen, but maybe they stepped away.
All right, I think I'll take this opportunity as it is 8:36.
Right.
Thank you so much to Emily, Jason, Cindy for this presentation, and Emily again, and for all the work that you've done with Waterfront Toronto, and for this, and for the park, and for all those in the Parks Department who are here as well, who've been answering questions. Thanks, Mark. This presentation will be posted online, most likely tomorrow, if not by Friday. And we will send out the link if you'd like to share it around. But otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. And please email us at info@waterfront.ca or drop us a line on Twitter or Facebook. We're always here to and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks very much, Emily and Jason.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.